Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for joining the webinar. I'm just going to talk quite generally about CAT4 and the reasons for producing the fourth edition, and then my colleague Phil Wildman will be looking in more detail at some of the report data that comes out of the assessment. As you probably know, the Cognitive Abilities Test is the UK's most widely used test of reading abilities. In the fourth edition, we have made some significant improvements, particularly to the report, which Phil will be able to highlight for you later. Just generally, CAT4 supports schools in understanding how students learn and what their academic potential might be. Therefore, we've used a different model to CAT3, and we'll be going through that very shortly. It's extremely useful for highlighting students with high ability, but it's also very useful in indicating who might be underachieving, those coasting students. The new reports facilitate communication with parents, with students themselves, with teachers and senior leaders. We've got a report that covers off all of those different stakeholders. Importantly, CAT4 will give you a measure of ability that can offer a context for attainment information, whether that's from other tests, for example, our progress test in English, progress test in maths, or data that is held within the school that is based on your teacher assessment. So it gives you that context, the ability of the child, the potential of the child, and also through the model that we have used in CAT4, the profile of learning bias, which Phil will be showing you just a little bit later on. So why we produced a fourth edition? We're now into the year of CAT4. It was launched in September 2012, and that was about 10 years after the launch of CAT3. So there are several reasons. Clearly, when you're producing an assessment, particularly one where there is a verbal content, it's really, really important that the content of that assessment is relevant. So it's really important to review and revise the content of your assessment. Also to refresh the data. Even though we find in ability testing the data tends to be stable over time, it's very important every 8 to 10 years to produce a new standardisation, and that's what we've done. We have a model, and I'll be talking about that very shortly. Importantly, this webinar is to help of the third edition understand why it's important to move to the fourth edition, not just for those reasons I've given, the new model, the new content and the new standardisation, but also that we will be phasing out third edition. We're no longer available from this August, and the paper edition no longer available from August 2016. Some of the things that come with CAT4, we took advice from customers, we talked to customers about the outcomes from CAT, and almost universally we were told that teachers needed narrow explanation of the statistical data in the report. They wanted the statistical data, they wanted the graphs, they wanted the table, but they needed that to be interpreted to a certain degree. So we've taken that on board and have extended the suite of reports that comes with CAT4. We wanted, based on research, we wanted to produce a different structure which included a separate spatial ability test, which was done in 2011, is based on 25,000 students across both the UK. Our new structure has reduced the overall testing time slightly, and we produced paper and digital versions concurrently. Since we published CAT4 in 2012, we have also produced a paper download extension, and that enables you now to carry out CAT testing from you. So we have a dedicated paper test for in Year 2 and Year 3. Just to highlight, although I'm aware of this, the benefits of digital testing, the paper tests, the answer sheets have to be sent away to be scored. We have a service which turns these round in about 15 working days, very often in a much shorter time, and get all of the reports with that if you buy into those. In terms of CAT Digital, as soon as you have finished your testing, you can run those reports. So it's very, very quick and reliable. You choose what you want to generate, who you want to report on. There's a great deal of flexibility in terms of reporting. And moving from CAT3 to CAT4 can be assured of continuity of data, whether they're moving from paper to paper or paper to digital. Important aspect of the addition of a full spatial test. The reasons we did that are several and various, but just to put it succinctly, we felt that including one spatial subtest within the non-verbal battery was not really giving an accurate profile of it, because non-verbal reasoning and spatial ability, they are really very separate things. Non-verbal reasoning can be characterized as a synthesis of verbal and skills. And if you're a more verbal thinker, you can actually perform very well on a non-verbal reasoning test by applying your verbal skills. A spatial ability test is a much purer test and depends on both visual and spatial skills. It's very, very difficult for a highly verbal student to verbalize their way through a spatial question. So it's a much purer measure of spatial ability. It means that your non-verbal reasoning is not contaminated with a further spatial test. And it's allowed us to produce this model which compares verbal ability with spatial ability. Where the research from America has come in and supported this approach, there's a lot of research which has shown over many decades that it is very useful when you're looking across the abilities to include a measure of spatial ability, because that will highlight students with very particular skills. Even where a student has uniformly high skills, you know that spatial ability is perhaps slightly higher meaning for that particular student. Produced offers up an extreme spatial bias, and that means that students will have low verbal skills. So that's something, again, that is very important for people teaching those particular students to understand that they have this ability in the spatial area, but it's at the expense of much weaker verbal skills. So for that student to be able to maximise that spatial ability, potential in that particular area, that support will be needed in terms of their verbal skills. Quickly to run through a few of the benefits of CAT4. So as I said, we're looking at developed abilities and likely academic potential, and in fact we produce a range of indicators at different levels, for example for the end of Key Stage 2, for GCSE, for A-level, and these indicators are based on very, very large sets of data where we compare CAT4 results with outcomes at those during a child's school career, based on real data. Our profile will help you understand strengths, weaknesses, and learning preferences, and we'll see a little bit more about that when Phil shows the report. We're now looking at 4 distinct areas of ability, and these are the areas that underpin academic success. And we know that a lot of schools are using CAT4 when children transfer into secondary, and that gives them a very, very accurate baseline, and they can compare attainment data to that baseline for ability. But we're also seeing a bigger uptake in primary, where primary schools are doing a similar thing when the children are 7 or 8 years old. Fully standardized, seamless approach. So if you start assessing your children in year 2 or year 3, you have got that continuity of assessment, because the assessment that is presented to the children is the same. The different level increases, obviously, but it's assessing in exactly the same way. Definitely the feedback we have from users, these are a big benefit from CAT4 that we didn't really have in 3. And looking ahead a little bit, the combination report at the moment exists for the group reading test, progress in maths. If any of you are looking to use our new progress test series, by the end of September, we will CAT4 combination report that allows you to compare ability in terms of CAT4 with attainment either through the new group reading test or with progress test maths and test English. And that's really, really useful, because it takes, for example, the bubble score from CAT4 and compares it with the English score from progress test in English. And that gives you a nice analysis of, again, of how are performing in the context of their ability as measured by CAT. So I hope that's given you a whistle-stop tour through CAT. I'm sorry it's a little bit. Phil is now going to go into more detail and look at the reports, where I think you'll find a lot of interest.
Very much, thanks, Sue. Yes, as Sue said, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to have a look at the suite of reports and really try and emphasise where the CAT4 is different to the CAT3. And a few overview points out. The main difference is into the way that the report put together is that we've tried to make them specific to particular audiences, groups of people. That data will be of misuse. I think it's fair to say that in the old reporting system, you've got a kind of tsunami of data all in one go, and it was very hard to see the next steps or where that data might be best used for the progress of the children. So I had to divide it up in some senses. That doesn't mean that the senior leaders report can't be looked at by the classroom teacher. It's more that we've tried to give an emphasis within each of those areas to particular audiences. Things already said, the key things was trying to make the data into useful information. And to fall back onto the old cliche, certainly schools have lots of data, but I'm not sure that even now that's always converted into useful information. So an increased amount of annotation from us. I should also say that beyond this, we are able to offer support in terms of training and guidance, and there's a lot of material on the website as well. A number of reports for these different audiences. The one that everyone gets as standard is the group report for teachers, and it's that one that I'm going to start with. But just before I do, if we look at all the reports that are available, I've highlighted the group report there because that is the standard report that everybody gets. Alongside that, the CAT4 Excel report, you might note that a CSV file in the old, we've upgraded that to an Excel report, as we found that that's the format that most people are using where they're not using the PDF reports. So the group report, then an individual report on students for teachers, and this gives a lot more granularity to the information. We've also taken, a brave step, and that is we've also created possible reports for students and for parents. Those two reports have a great deal in common, but do differ in a number of key ways, which we'll have a look at later. Report for senior leaders, I've also alluded to, in that that is where perhaps more of managerial reporting, particularly looking at subgroups, focus groups, always in reference to the UK sample, are looked at. Summary presentation for senior leaders is almost exactly the same data, but actually we produce it in the form of a PowerPoint. I will mention that again later when we have a little bit of a look at the specifics. So start off with then the group report for teachers. Now, it won't look as busy as this on yours. This is just an example with annotation to show parts of the report. So you may not be able to make out the detail, and however we try and cut and paste it for a PowerPoint presentation, it's always going to be quite difficult to see. So at the bottom of the screen there is a link to the page where you can actually have these reports in full size, and you'll be able to go through them yourselves and actually see the numbers, as it were. I'm just going to be talking in a broad look at what it contains. Unlike CAT4, here, in this first level of a group report, we've actually taken out the canines. We found that they were not being used by the average person in the classroom, and in fact, including them on this report was just adding an unnecessary level of complexity. So here, you may not be able to see the actual numbers, but we have for verbal, quantitative, non-verbal, and special a breakdown of the standardized age scores for each of those 4 batteries. The batteries also are put together in the overall column, which you can see at the end, which, and some schools, this is as far as they initially go, is in looking at the average scores. And I'm not saying that this is wrong by any means, and certainly a mean CAT score does give you an overall idea of that level of developed ability that we apply day to day in learning that is a form of many different ways that it's presented. I would argue that beyond the mean, the average, is where the detail lies. What do averages do? They smooth data. So where we might have spiky data in strengths in verbal or quantitative, or even in the new area of spatial, actually smoothed out when you look at an average. So I would definitely argue that if you're using the mean score, that you don't forget about the individual battery scores, which have useful information about individuals. So this table does include all the individuals, and it includes a score in 4 batteries. Okay. Slightly more detail. It's quite a tricky one to see, I think. But if we go straight to the little bar chart at the bottom of the page, what we've done here is we've tried to show performance levels for the whole cohort in 4 different areas of CAT4, battery of assessments, and each of those has a different colour. So verbal, the blue, and quantitative, the purple, and so on. Shown against a background of a red hill mountain shape, which is the UK normal distribution. From that, where there are differences between the bars and the line, we can see where our particular cohort has greater numbers or smaller numbers than in UK distribution. Now, if you're able to do it in the visual form, you can see that how differences within the 4 batteries are represented against this UK distribution. If you're more into seeing a table of data, that data is shown in the table above it, or against that national average. One of the key things about standardized assessments is the ability to go beyond the classroom or on the school and show levels of performance, and in this case, developed ability, that matched against a whole UK distribution. It's hard for an individual school to come up with a way of benchmarking their individual students' ability or performance against such a wide sample one of these particular slices in terms of performance that you get in the group report for teachers. We're actually slice the data for focus groups such as free school meals, ethnicity, English and additional language, and so on, and those reports are part of the senior leaders report. We'll see later. Graph is I think I mentioned it right at the start. In CAT4, there's a difference to CAT3 is that we've moved to showing verbal against spatial. We find that difference, using verbal as the most extreme verbal type of reasoning, to spatial being the most anti-verbal, if you like, the most opposite to verbal, we can place people on a continuum between those two extremes and show where cognitive strengths and weaknesses lie along that continuum. This is just a scatter graph giving that analysis. So there we can see that dashed black line running from left to right. That's where there would actually be no difference in the individual's verbal standardized score as opposed to this spatial standardized score. The area that runs parallel to that is where statistically differences are not significant. The figure perpendicularly to that dashed black line, the more that we're calling it a bias. The more we go towards the light oranges and darker orange and reds, that is where an individual would be more verbally biased in the way that they can take on new information and process it. And conversely, the way they head towards the green and light blue and purple, the more spatially they're biased in that they can take on information and process it better in that format. It also tells you another thing at the same time, and that is generalized ability levels. The more a student is towards the bottom left, the lower their generalized ability scores, and the more towards the top right, the higher. So always when we're looking at relative differences in terms of their bias, we shouldn't forget these may not always be made manifest depending on their individual generalized level of ability. For instance, there's a high correlation between spatial reasoning and later success in the STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering and maths. But imagine that perhaps wouldn't be so easily expressed if overall ability levels were somewhat lower, especially perhaps even in verbal, where often the educational system and assessment tend to favour those that are good verbally reasoning. Beyond that scatter graph, we take each of those 7 groups from extreme verbal bias running to extreme spatial bias, and for each of those groups we're able to list the individual students that fall into those groups. Alongside that are three or four different bullet points trying to give you an idea of what it actually might mean to be verbal biased or mildly verbally biased in terms of their learning in the classroom. So here in the group report we can see group students that fall into the bands. In a sample, it does in fact cover the whole of those 7 groups. To summarise the group report for teachers then, scores for students in defined groups with standardised age scores and a group rank, getting that key national picture. We can also see overall learning preference profiles across the group, and we're getting an idea of how that individual profile might affect their learning. What I haven't included in the group report is, of course, the indicators which give an estimation of average attainment in national tests and exams. And this is often a very good initial national benchmark, again, to set individual personalised targets. Okay, let's look at how that's developed in terms of an individual report. So we have an individual report, again, not all, this is just part of it, but here you can see at the top that we have that verbal quantitative, non-verbal and spatial. It is very important to look at spatial verbal differences for the reasons that I think both of us have said earlier. But I think we should also lose track of the other areas we're assessing. Quantity, for instance, is very, very useful in looking at overall ability of a student to take on information in tables, graphs, charts, which is a very big part also of STEM subjects and across the board, really. In that bottom scatter graph, we just have the single position of that one individual. And on this one, that comes out as a moderate spatial bias. With an individual report that we burnt with the group is each individual we're able to produce a page of narrative. And this page of narrative is for an individual, and again it tells us about what it might mean to have a bias of any sort, but here that's much extended, and the part of implications for teaching and learning is much larger. And it isn't rocket science, but it is, as Sue says, an attempt to get the data to where it have most use. And if one of these points is useful in moving a child forward, I think it's worth it. You may disagree with part of these, and so you should. This is developed from a model, a statistical model. You are the people that work with individuals day to day. You are the ones that will know their strengths. But this, I think, might shed a little bit more light on it. I did mention indicators before, certainly they're still there. These are CSE indicators with the two levels that we're now giving. What before with a single indicator, which I don't think we actually labelled, but is now called the most likely. The most likely, as it always was, and that is the score that of the 50th percentile of the individuals with a similar CAT score achieved in the class. And the if challenge one is the one that was achieved by the top 25% of students with a similar CAT score in the past. So you can see that it is now a benchmark rather than some kind of mythical prediction. This is part of seeing what value you can add, how you can work with a student to actually move them forward. Just two other things. One, before I go any further, I should say that as you can see, these are letters of the alphabet. Of course, these will be mapped to the new numerical system for GCSE. On the left-hand side, those probabilities are great for opening up conversations with individuals. Along the line of perhaps, there you can see that for art and design, the most likely grade is in fact a BC, because that's the highest percentage that in the past people of that similar CAT score got. But you can see how it could be used to open up the conversation to say, how can we work with you to get you into that 15% that in fact got an A? Or indeed, that 6% who got an A star. It's great for the kind of meeting. Summary of individual reports. This is where that detailed breakdown is. This is where stanines reappear. This is where we can see very clearly in terms of the narrative how that particular cognitive strength and bias might affect their learning, and also the indicators alongside that really useful chances table. Again, on new is an individual report for parents. Here, this is not quite the most up-to-date slide because the top level, below average, average and above average aren't there. They're less, I think, in your face, as it were. It's important that the people should be aware of them without being sort of, thrust into your face. But it is important that we're aware of. Part of that narrative that I showed you earlier is now used in this parental report. It's vital that we in many groups as possible in the overall work we're doing with children to maximise their potential. So we have produced one for the students themselves. It's very similar to this, but the narrative obviously talks more about what they can do and what difficulties they may have found in the past, or this might help explain that. I haven't included that slide because it's quite similar, at this first level. This report is very much, as I hinted at before, more managerial in a sense, about individuals, but certainly about vital areas such as looking at focus groups, special interest groups. This one's gender, but it could just as easily be free school meals, or ethnicity, or Indian additional language, or indeed be one of the two customizable fields you might want to set up for disadvantaged students in terms of pupil premium, or anything else. Secondary school may be wanting to monitor field schools separately. It's entirely your choice. But what is important is it's always able to look at the national picture. It's not about looking in that subgroup and by setting low standards for that group. Sue almost stole my thunder earlier on because she talked about a combination report. This is available currently for the progress in English and the progress in maths and the new group reading test alongside the CAT test as the anchor. And what it does is it shows, in the case of progress English, the CAT4 verbal scores alongside and categorises the change in the scores, and that way we can see perhaps it's an easy way of making that initial analysis of perhaps underachievers or coasters. We can see people perhaps their abilities far ahead of current performance, or even vice versa. What could be actually allowing them to perform better than their ability level might show? What's doing right in the classroom? What strategies have we got that are really moving these children forward? I think this is pretty much what Sue said at the start, so I won't read through it again for you. But for me, I'd probably jump to number 4. It is about, for me, looking at the individual students and getting the most out of them, whether that's underachievers or whether it's those that are already achieving very at high levels, but we get more. Or checking for those whose generalised ability levels are perhaps lower that we might have missed, and it's important that we get strategies in place to support them. Anyway, that's pretty much for me. I think there's a little bit of detail there about how you could move from CAT3 to CAT4. In terms of a telephone, we have a dedicated team here who are around to answer your questions, and they'll also respond to the email. And along the way, we've seen a number of links to the website, and there's that final one that keeps recurring on the slides, which is all about the upgrading process.